Hi there, this is your Serial Cynic, and I'm back again with another episode here on the Serial Cynic channel. Believe it or not, I'm actually here sitting, I want to say below or adjacent Trump Tower. I feel contaminated already. I feel like I'm in the belly of the beast, so to speak. But it was a quiet location that I could find here in the city. As I often do, you can see my background, and as I often do, I try to show you my surroundings. So it's cold outside, so I look all bundled up and everything like that. And let me get my microphone out of here so you guys can hear me much better. But let me go ahead and show you the surroundings, if I can. So trying to be somewhat comfortable here today. There's going to be some noise behind me and around me, as there is a little coffee shop over here. As you can see, there are other people around me, and there are going to be a couple sitting right behind me in a minute. Well, I don't know. It looks like they moved. So I'll try to see if I can get this topic in. Along the way, I plan to come up with some other topics other than what I'm going to talk about right now. But being that I've kind of gotten caught up in this topic here about the Black Hebrew Israelites, I figure I will speak some more about it. But as I said before, as we go along, this channel is going to diversify. I'm going to return back to more or less the primary topics that I want to talk about here. But again, there'll be some diversified topics along the way. But for right now, we're back to the Black Hebrew Israelites. And part of the reason why we're back to it is because I've received some feedback, at least in the comment section, on some of the videos that I've done so far already. First of all, let me make a couple of disclaimers up front, or I should address some things up front based on some of the things that I've received in the comments. Number one, I am not a coon. I had to laugh at that one. No, there's no white person paying me to go ahead and speak down about our black people and our black heritage and all that good stuff. There's no such thing. I'm not working for the man to go ahead and strike down the heritage you claim that we have. You know, I'm not into that. Number two, I am not a person who's in love with snow bunnies. That came from someone in the comment section. Apparently they're from Angola and they live in France. And this is the claim that they were making. I don't know how they came about telling me this, that I love snow bunnies, which is another way to say I love white women. Oh my goodness, I had to laugh. No, sir. My wife is a black woman from Guyana. Black women are who I love. I have nothing against white women. I don't have any hatred. I don't have any weird concept about them or anything along that line. Basically, they're just not my cup of tea for some to be with. Not because I hate them or not because I think they're blue-eyed devils or anything along that line. It's just not for me, okay? So I want you to understand that. And no, I am not on here debunking the legacy of the black man and whatever other nonsense I've heard down there or whatever. This is just for the sake of conversation, number one. And number two, just because you say it doesn't mean I have to accept it. The whole Black Israelite thing that came up here in regard to me talking about it had a lot to do with the fact that when I started this channel, people were asking me about them. And part of the reason why they were asking me was because a group of them showed up on the island in the Caribbean where I was raised, which is the island of St. Kitts, which incidentally, one of the proponents of the Black Hebrew Israelite theology one of the modern proponents of this was actually born on the island of St. Kitts. His last name was Matthews. I can't remember his first name, but here in New York City is where he basically made a name for himself, and even started, I think, a couple of rabbinical schools or rabbinical school or something along that line for black people who believe that they are Black Israelites. But anyway, a group of them showed up down there on the island of St. Kitts. I don't know who invited them. They got a lot of pushback, but I'm sure their message resonated with a lot of people. And being that I was a part of a Facebook page dedicated to the islands of St. Kitts and Nevis, country in the Caribbean, twin island nation, it was brought to my attention, and people were looking for some feedback from me. And around the same time I was starting this channel, I figured, hey, what a great topic to start about. So this brought me to this little series that I have going about the Black Hebrew Israelites. Of course, I wouldn't say I take offense, because what they believe, as long as they're not harming anyone, is not bothering me, But I guess you can say what I take issue with, just in terms of conversation or debate, is the claim that they make. And I want to let it be known up front, as I've stated in my other videos, I am not denying that there might not be people, or there could not be people living on the African continent that, if possible, could trace their lineage or roots, or one side of their family or both sides of their family, back to the land of ancient Israel, or the people that live there. It is very plausible, very likely, considering the proximity of the land of Israel over to the African continent, that you had Jews, Israelites, whatever you want to call them, that traveled to Africa, northeastern Africa, and may have made their way over to West Africa, Southwest Africa, Southeast Africa, however you may want to look at it, in ancient times. Clearly, there were trading routes. Jews have always been known to be merchants, and they probably went into those areas and did such things where they traveled as merchants to sell goods, travel along the trade routes, and so forth. We also know that later on, at least in the era of West African slavery, that some of them featured prominently in the whole slave era, basically, on this side of the world. So yes, it would not be surprising to find that Yitzhak and Hezekiah and Malachi and whatever you want to call them could have traveled to the African continent with their families, with their children, with their wives, with their siblings or whatever, and stayed there and had children there and built communities. I'm not denying that could not have been possible. Of course, this is what Black Israelites say. Their theory is that in 586 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came and invaded the kingdom of Judah, that some of the Jews, or some of the Israelites, or Jews, whatever, from Judah escaped into the African continent and eventually made their, toward Egypt, and eventually made their way across to West Africa and founded communities there that over time grew into empires and so forth. That is their belief. Very, very plausible. I'm not denying that at all. I pointed out that somewhere along the line, they don't factor in another thing that could have happened, is that you could have had Jews who did make it over there, stayed amongst themselves, but proselytized. In other words, like Jehovah's Witnesses, went around basically expressing their faith, telling people about their faith, local Africans, that is, telling them about their faith. And you could have had local Africans that basically converted to Judaism 1,000 years ago, 500 years ago, 2,000 years ago, who could have converted, passed on their beliefs and so forth onto their children and onto their families. And the next thing you know, you have local Africans who are now practicing Jews and practicing the rituals and believing in the Jewish faith. So it would be very hard to distinguish who is a blood Jew and who was a converted Jew. To go and look 500 years later, 1,000 years later, 1,500 years later, and say, oh, look, they're practicing Judaistic practices. That must mean they're blood Jews, is rather simplistic. When you consider the fact that the people that you see practicing this stuff could be descendants of people who converted to Judaism. But you never really hear that. The irony to this, though, is the fact that the Black Hebrew Israelites, at least some groups of them, teach that the people we call Jews today are not blood Jews. Basically, they're false Jews. They're fake. And what's their premise for this? They say, well, these people, the Ashkenazi Jews as they're known, who settled more or less in the area of Germany and Poland and those areas, their argument is they're descendants of converted Jews. That when Khazaria was a kingdom, way back when, the nobility converted to Judaism. I don't know about the people on the whole in the kingdom, but the nobility converted to Judaism and thus began to practice Judaistic practices. But eventually, when the empire fell, they traveled westward and settled in what we call Germany today and those areas around there. So the Black Hebrew Israelites look at them and say, they're not real Jews. They are converted Jews. So they hold up that theory when it comes to the Khazarians. But when it comes to Africa, they look at themselves as blood Jews. The idea that some of these Africans or communities in Africa that claim links to Judaism or Jewishness or whatever the case might be, it's never mentioned that some of these people could have been descendants of converted Jews or Africans who converted to Judaism. Let's put it that way. Anyway, that was just basically a recap of what I've been talking about lately and more or less what they have in mind. But believe it or not, today I actually want to talk about something else that is very closely related to Black Hebrew Israelite theology. And I'm willing to bet, I know someone will want to go ahead and say, yeah, I knew about them all along, but I'm willing to bet that many people, even Black Israelites, are not even aware of this other group that incidentally and ironically believe just like they do. The difference is the color of the skin. Prior to me knowing about the Black Hebrew Israelites about a good 20 years ago, I want to say maybe about 5 years prior to that, or maybe more, I happened to work with a colleague. And she was a part of a church because back then I was a rabid Christian. And she happened to be go to a church, I should say, that was named the Worldwide Church of God. And it was quite interesting because I used to see their publications and so forth here in New York City. Now, what I'm talking about, I was living in Florida at the time. But prior to going to Florida, I used to see the Worldwide Church of God, their publication in Penn Station. I used to pick it up. I used to look at it. I used to read it. Thought it was pretty fascinating. I mentioned a lot of things that I was familiar with in terms of Christian theology. But I didn't know that there was something else that they taught. I think they've abandoned the teachings now, but I didn't know at the time that there was something else that they used to teach. How I found out about this was when I started working with this person. And she told me that she was a Christian. And back in those days, because I was such a rabid Christian, I used to always want to check the churches of what other Christians, attended, what they believe. So I went looking it up. And when I started looking it up and I started realizing that she was going to the Worldwide Church of God, and I started reading up on them, I started to notice that they espouse a particular theology that they call British Israelism. British Israelism. But they went a step further from the original belief. And that is, they believed that the United States and England, the people, of course the white folks that is, from both of these nations are actually the descendants of two of ancient Israel's lost tribes. The interesting thing about it is the Black Israelites believe that they're descendants of the tribe of Judah. In British Israelism, as it was called back then, they believe that, again, the white folks of America and the white folks of the British Isles, I guess you can say England, Scotland, and Ireland, they believe that they are descendants of two of the lost tribes of Israel. And their belief, just like the Black Hebrew Israelites, goes like this. And let me give you a little bit of background. In ancient, according to the Bible, mind you, there was a kingdom, what I want to say 3,000 years ago, and the kingdom was known as the Kingdom of Israel, according to the Bible. Somewhere along the line, there was a feud. As a matter of fact, let me go back a little further. According to the Bible, Abraham had a son, and his son's name was Isaac. Isaac then went on and had a son by the name of Jacob. Jacob then went on and had 12 sons. I think he had a daughter in between. Her name was Dinah. But the 12 sons is where the focus is on. Again, consider the Bible as a patriarchal book. So he had 12 sons. Upon his deathbed, Jacob basically started to bless his children, his 12 sons. And as he was blessing them, he was speaking to them about the land of Canaan and more or less their inheritance of what they will receive. So he goes on and he blesses them. But when he gets around to his son Joseph, who basically saved the family from extermination, when he got to Joseph, he said, "You know what, Joseph, you have two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And because you have been the pinnacle of the family, I am going to make sure that I bless your two sons." So he did. Now, by the time we get to Moses, again, according to the Bible, and the people of Israel at the time, now forming a tribe of their own, of millions of people, according to the Bible, they're about to move into this promised land known as Canaan back in those days. When they arrived in the land, or before they arrived in the land, Moses basically started carving up the land and giving portions of the land to the individual children, or I should say the individual tribes. These is from Jacob's 12 sons. So of course his sons had children, they had children, they had children, and they all had their own little tribe running around the place that made up Israel. So Moses now, basically looking over into the promised land, starts to bequeath land to the individual tribes. So he would say, okay, well, the tribe of Dan, you're going to take the northwest. The tribe of Judah, you're going to take the south. Manasseh and Ephraim, you're going to be right here. Benjamin, you're going to be over there. And Simeon, you're going to be over here, and so forth. This is how the land of Canaan was divided up amongst the 12 tribes of the 12 children of Jacob. So because of Jacob's promise, or his blessings upon his children and their posterity, in the dividing of the land of Canaan, Moses, of course, bequeaths Manasseh with his portion and Ephraim with his portion. But somewhere along the line, after the nation or the kingdom was won, there was some division between what we call the northern kingdoms and the kingdom of Judah, which was to the south. So you had 10 tribes to the north and basically 2 tribes to the south. And at the time, the rule of the kingdom was in the city of Jerusalem. But again, the northern tribes feel that they were not being fairly represented and so forth. So there was some schism and division between the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes. The northern tribes did not want to remain loyal to Jerusalem, which was in the tribe of Judah in the south. So they broke away and became independent and became known as the Kingdom of Israel, whereby the two remaining tribes, Judah and Benjamin, came together to form the Kingdom of Judah. After a few hundred years of being in existence, the Kingdom of Israel fell to the invading Assyrian armies, whereby the Kingdom of Judah basically hung around for an extra 100 years or so. But what the Assyrians did, and their practice was, to prevent rebellion, they picked up these Israelites, according to the Bible, and basically scattered them all around the Assyrian Empire. But the belief is most of these people that they scattered, most of these Israelites that they scattered, were scattered back in the area of what we will call Iraq today, which was basically home base for the Assyrians. That's where their capital was, Nineveh. So the Assyrians went and scattered these Israelites all over the place. They scattered them to the north, they scattered them to the south, but I guess you can say more or less to the north. So it was basically Nineveh, somewhere around the Euphrates River, and north of that, which we will call today the areas of the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, Uzbekistan, those areas out there, and what we will call Iran today, and further north of that. Now, there has always been this term that's used that these are the 10 lost tribes of Israel. But the belief is they were never really lost. It's just that they were just scattered about, assimilated into other cultures, or just went off and held their own communities and so forth. Now, with the British Israelism, their belief is that these Israelites went on and founded tribes known as people like the Scythians, the Crimeans, and the Goths. That they founded these tribes, and these invading tribes eventually moved westward, crippling the Roman Empire, and eventually made their way all the way to the British Isles. And making their way over there, they settled there. And so the belief goes that the lost tribes of Israel weren't really lost, but they became the forerunners of the people that settled on the British Isles. And thus, British Israelism say, hey, they settled over here. We are the descendants of these people. And we are descendants of the lost tribe of Israel, or the lost tribes of Israel. And so they carry this belief with them. Similar to the Black Hebrew Israelites saying, when the kingdom of Judah was invaded, when it was their turn, and Nebuchadnezzar came to conquer the kingdom of Judah, that some of their people escaped and ran into Africa and ended up in different places of Africa, notably West Africa. And they take that then to say, hey, we West Africans, or people amongst the West Africans, are Black Hebrew Israelites. Likewise, the British Israelites believe that, hey, you had Israelites who basically were scattered by the Assyrians, who made their way up below the Black Sea, southern Russia, all those areas up there, and eventually made their way westward, ended up in the British Isles, and their claim is, we are thus, well, these white folks in England, Scotland, Ireland, and eventually over into the Americas, the United States, are the descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. See the similarity? And just like the Black Hebrew Israelites, they go through the Bible and they cherry pick verses to back up their claim. First of all, this concept first somewhat seemed to have appeared back in 1590, pretty much long before the Black Hebrew Israelites started their thing. And I would go ahead and venture to say that perhaps the Black Israelite movement could have been in part a reaction to this movement without even knowing that it was. But anyway, back in 1590, a French Huguenot basically published a book known as the 10 Lost Tribes. And it was the first place that you saw the expression Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Scandinavian, Germanic, and associated cultures were the direct descendants of the ancient Israelites. That was back in 1590. So that concept was floating around out there, lingering around out there somewhere. But it was a man by the name of Richard Brothers who lived in England between 1757 and 1824 who basically is credited with more or less bringing it mainstream. Of course, a lot of people looked at him like he was nuts, and sure enough, he ended up in an asylum with this fantasy that he taught. But it was later picked up by an astronomer from Scotland by the name of Piazzi Smith. And he went and sat down and started crunching some numbers and coming up with some calculations to connect the Great Pyramids and the throne of England to the throne of David. Basically teaching that the kings of England and the queens were royal heirs to the throne of David or came through the lineage of David. Again, where have you heard this before? And so basically based on this, he went ahead to say that we, people in the British Isles, descend from the lost tribes of Israel. But they made a clear distinction where they said we Israelites are Israelites. We're not Jews. Because Judah was a different kingdom. And they went a different route in history, in the annals of history. Of course, the Black Hebrew Israelites picked that up and ran with that. They believe that they're descendants from the lost tribes of Israel, the 10 tribes that originally broke away from Jerusalem and Judah. So this is basically how they go. Now, to add more to their claim, Josephus, the great Jewish historian who lived around the time of, if you want to look at a time frame, around the time of Jesus. I think he lived after, a little bit after, but according to the Bible, their time frame would have overlapped, but Josephus lived much longer. And he was one of them that said, the entire body of the people of Israel remained in that country. I guess referring to when the Assyrians took them and exiled them along the Euphrates River and beyond. But I guess he was saying that a lot of them remained near and about the Euphrates River in modern-day Iraq. But he goes on, he says, wherefore there are but 2 tribes in Asia and Europe subject to the Romans, while the 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now and are an immense multitude. This is Josephus writing back, 2,000 years ago. And he's basically saying that the majority of the tribes stayed in and around the Euphrates, but 2 of those tribes went on to Asia and Europe, and they're subject to the Romans, as you know, the Roman Empire was the dominant empire at the time. So British Israelites look at this and it lends credence to their theory. See, hey, some of these people ended up in Europe. This is Josephus writing 2,000 years ago, being somewhat of a witness to what happened to those tribes. So this is basically what goes on. There's another thing that they do. The Black Israelites looked at the fact that the Scythians, their king, or I think their king was known as the Saka, or Sak, or Sake. And this is also mentioned back as far as Herodotus, who lived before Josephus. And Josephus, who also mentions this. So I think the Scythians were also known as the Saka, or the Sak, S-A-K-A, S-A-K-A, however you want to pronounce it. So when British Israelites saw this word, They looked on and they started using etymology, which of course has no basis whatsoever in what they're saying, but they went ahead and basically said Saka is short or corruption of the name Isaac, the father of Jacob. Again, using this to claim or hinge an identity on the fact that they are descendants of Isaac, of Jacob, of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. So again, you can see how they derive their theology and how they arrived at some of these. And of course, they went on to say things like, you can find, because I think one of the things that they said is that the tribe, one of the tribes that populated these areas, or descendants of people that populated this area, is from the tribe of Dan. Dan was, I believe, the most northern of the tribes, or the most northwestern of the tribes, going more toward Asia Minor. So it was more likely that they were quicker to kind of like make it easier over into Europe. So this is what they did. And they said, hey, the proof is in the names of some of the places that you find in Europe. Just like the Black Hebrew Israelites turn around and say you can find in the Igbo or Igbo tribes of southeastern Nigeria, you can find in their names Yah, Y-A-H, which must mean that if that's how you see it, and you see the name Yah, that indicates that these people are showing respect and reverence in their names, in their given names, to Yahweh, the God of Israel, or the God of the Jews. Well, guess what? The British Israelites did something similar. Not so much in the names, in their given names, but in the names of places in Europe. So remember, they're talking about the tribe of Dan, D-A-N. And they will tell you, hey, look at some of our tribal names, or the names that our wanderers left behind, which is a testament, in their belief, to our ancient ancestor Dan. So they look at it and they say, look at the name like Denmark. Because they believe that the invaders, the descendants of the lost tribes, came by way of Denmark into the British Isles. So they say, look at names like Denmark, or the names like Dardanelles in Turkey, or the Danube River, or Macedonia, or Dunkirk, or Dunglo in Ireland, or Dundee in Scotland, and the names London. And supposedly, they ascribe this to the lost tribe, which is connected to some mythical Irish Tuatha De Danann, or I guess that means tribe of Dan. There's more I could say about it.